So I'm an apocalyptimist. I saw that meme on Facebook about a month ago, and it's like, that's it. That's how I describe this time. An apocalyptimist is one that sees that things are going pretty terribly, but still has hope that everything will turn out okay. Are you an apocalyptimist? And yes, I had to practice saying that over and over again. Apocalyptimist. Say it with me. Apocalyptimist. I mean, really, sometimes I notice it in myself and I wonder if I'm all right. Like, I still see the world falling apart, and yet I'm still optimistic. I see Texans that are cold without water and heat with tremendous destruction this past week. And yet, I still have hope that it will lead to talking about renewable energy and the new Green Deal. I see the uprising that happened at the Capitol in January, and I watched way too much of the impeachment, and I am still optimistic that there will be renewed pressure on us to cherish our democracy and to work towards a progressive movement that we know that is so possible. I see the backlash to our Black leaders, the trials of this summer's racial protests, and yet I am still optimistic that more and more people are willing to talk about race, that you all are going to be willing to talk to people in Phoenix, to look at race and grow in our understanding of our joint humanity. Wednesday was the first day of the Christian tradition of Lent. Lent is the 40 days of preparation for Easter. And Christian holidays have a lot of hope embedded in them. Lent is about preparation for the hopeful message of Easter. And it's kind of a different kind of hope than Advent, which is about the coming of the Savior. And I've joked that during this pandemic that I feel like I've been just talking about the two things all the way through this pandemic, which is I've been talking a lot about lament and I've been talking a lot about hope. They are two sides to the same coin. Many of us have found hope in the inauguration and in the vaccines. Others are struggling some days to find hope. But I find that many of us are inherently optimistic, often grateful, no matter how hard things get. And there is research to support that. A 2009 study showed that humans are by nature optimistic. They were looking at people in 140 countries. 85% of them expected their lives to be better in 5 years. And 95 of them said that when you compare it to 5 years ago, 5 years will definitely be better than that. The researchers said that the results provide compelling evidence that optimism is a universal phenomenon, even though we know at any given time things could get better or worse. In case you're wondering, optimism was highest in Ireland, Brazil, Denmark, and New Zealand. The United States was 10th in the most optimistic countries. Another study from Michigan State in 2020 showed that we are optimistic for most of our lives, even when difficult things happen to us. Optimism increases all through our lives, starting when we're about 15, and it does plateau a little bit when we get into our 70s, but still doesn't necessarily decrease. Even people with fairly bad circumstances who have tough things happen in their lives look to their futures and life ahead and feel optimistic. Counterintuitively, they found that really hard things like deaths and divorce really didn't change a person's outlook of the future. We often think that really hard things in life will change that optimism, but the research proved that that wasn't necessarily the case. Other research has shown that levels of optimism are linked to disparate bodily functions like inflammation and stroke risk and length and quality of sleep. So where does this optimism come from? Is there a theological or life meaning-making aspect of this optimism, I thought it would be fun to explore some of the theological boundaries of optimism and hope, especially from a liberal religious perspective. So this morning, I'm bringing some perspectives of three liberal and more modern theologians, philosophers, and moral ethicists. So we're going to welcome this morning the voices of Rebecca Solnit, James Luther Adams, and Dr. Cornel West. Rebecca Solnit is a writer, a historian, activist. If you're not following her, you should. She's so cool. She's written on feminism, Western and Indigenous history, power, and social change. But she has also written about the nuances and complexities of sustaining hope in our times of readily available despair. She encourages us to look at the entirety of the change in our world and see the chaos and the destruction and the turmoil, but also see the extraordinary change that's come out of it as the foundation for our optimism. She said, "The moment passed long ago, but despair, defeatism, cynicism, and the amnesia and assumptions from which they often arise have not dispersed, even as the most wildly, unimaginably magnificent things came to pass. Progressive, populist, power, and grassroots constituencies have had many victories. Popular power has continued to be the profound force for change. And the changes we've undergone, both wonderful and terrible, are astonishing. This is an extraordinary time of vital, transformative movements that could not be foreseen. It's also a nightmarish time. Full engagement requires the ability to perceive both." Solnit has us look to the challenging developments like climate change and growing income inequality and the rise of automation as a dehumanizing superpower, but she invites us to be equally present for the counterpoint. She says, hope doesn't mean denying these realities. It means facing them and addressing them by remembering what else the 21st century has brought, including the movements, the heroes, and shifts in consciousness that address these things now. She looks at movements like marriage equality and Black Lives Matter and says, this has been a truly remarkable decade for movement building, social change, and deep, profound shifts in ideas, perspective, and frameworks for broad parts of the population. And of course, backlashes against all those things. So this is where I think we need to dig into the nuance. Hope and optimism cannot just be an abdication of action or knowledge, just a spectator sport of thinking everything is fine so I can just go off and do my thing. We know that there is tremendous suffering and destruction and pain all around us. The hope we're talking about today is an invitation to act, knowing that things can still get better. Solnit calls it, I love this line, an account of complexities and uncertainties with openings, the openings that we're looking for. Now, you can't speak of modern theology and of hope and not include James Luther Adams and his 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. I know I've spoken about that before. I know that you've heard about it here at UUCP from other ministers as well. Adams was a Unitarian parish minister, a social activist, and a scholar. He was undoubtedly the most influential theologian among American Unitarian Universalists of the 20th century. And he helped define what we think of as liberal theology today. In particular, his essay on the 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism are still very relevant today. He says that liberal theology is 1, a living tradition, 2, a free tradition, 3, a justice-oriented tradition, 4, a tradition of agency, we make good things happen, and 5, a hopeful tradition. When he talks about hope, he says that Liberalism holds the resources, both divine and human, that are available for the achievement of meaningful change, and that justifies an attitude of ultimate optimism. Essentially, he's saying that we are always changing, that we have the power to make that change, and that this positive change means that we should be hopeful. Adams said that liberal religious communities are storehouses and witnesses for what he calls ultimate optimism. It is therefore not just a good thing to have hope, but it's our duty. Another of my great theological heroes is Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a philosopher, a scholar on Black studies and liberation theology, and an activist. If you've ever gotten an email from me, the quote at the end of it is a Cornel West one that says, "Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public." Dr. West has actually been called one of the most influential thinkers about where we're finding hope in this pandemic world. This past summer, he said this about hope. Hope is not spectatorial, it is participatorial. If you are already in the mess, you are already in the foam. Hope is a verb as much as it is a virtue. It is a consequence of your action as it is a source of your action. Hope is something you find in your immersion, and you decide you're going to fight it until the end. I love that. It is a consequence of your action as it is a source of your action. Dr. West also says hope is not a mood. It's not how you are feeling about things. Instead, he calls it a virtue. He says that a virtue sets a standard for how you are to behave, how you are to act in the world, how you are to manifest your spirit in deeds. Hope is a verb. Hope is a virtue. Hope is how we act in the world, how we manifest our spirit in deeds. It is saying that we are seeing the world is not living up to our ideals, and that we can work to make it better. It is saying that we can't change how racism affects our world without some change ourselves and working for more change in the world. And we are going to hopefully act to affect that change. I hope that it is this hope that gives us the courage to try something new like phone banking. It is this participatory action that says we can't just wait and hope that policing changes through other people's actions, that we are the ones to help make that change. It is the hope that our world will improve and the knowledge that it takes our actions to make it so. So Rebecca Solnit says to find hope and optimism in the nuances and the balance between tragedy and change, noticing the great accomplishments that come over the long haul. James Luther Adams says that liberal traditions are storehouses of hope. And Dr. Cornel West finds hope through our actions, our participation in the collective freedom of all of us. So I ask you, where do you find hope? Where is it that your Apocaloptimism shows up? I know that I found hope in the gentleman that I took a Greyhound ticket to yesterday, who was in detention at Eloy since last November, that I was connected with through his family and their minister in Omaha, Nebraska, and who was finally able to get out of detention and is on his way to see his family and have hope for a better future. I have hope still in the elections in Georgia, and that people can organize and make change happen everywhere. I see hope from our kids from last week's amazing service, which so much of it has stuck with me, and who see the world with optimism and love. I see hope by looking at the changes in my lifetime that allow me to be a female, lesbian, married minister who has a voice in issues that matter to me. So where is your hope? What is the source of your apocalyptimism? And how does that hope manifest in your actions? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We must accept finite disappointment, but we shall never lose infinite hope." In these apocalyptic times, may you find your hope in the long view of things, the small miracles, the big accomplishments, and in the spirit of this beloved community we have together. So might it be for all of us.